Another teacher accused of sexually assaulting a young student. This time, it's a woman in her 30s at a North Carolina middle school. We're breaking down this latest case of alleged teacher misconduct with forensic psychiatrist Dr. Ziv Cohen. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Let's talk about Heidi Monroe, a Spanish teacher who got fired from her job, arrested and locked up on a $400,000 bond after accusations that she raped a student. Now, Monroe, a married 37-year-old, originally from Colombia, she's been a teacher at Welcome Middle School in Greenville, North Carolina for 2 years. But after she was arrested on June 11th, she was suspended, but then her work visa was revoked and she was fired. So court documents, they cite this incident between Monroe and a 14-year-old student on April 5th. We don't know if the victim was male or female. We don't have a lot of details about what happened here. Pitt County deputies say that the school resource officer started the investigation that led to her arrest. She was arraigned on 3 felony charges: statutory rape of a child under the age of 15, sexual activity with a student, and indecent liberties with a child. My research indicates that in North Carolina, to give you an idea of this, the rape charge, for example, is a Class B1 felony that usually has a sentencing range of 16 to 40 years in prison, but the max could even be life in prison for certain offenses. So you're kind of getting a sense of what we're dealing with here. She's expected back in court later this week. Now, although we don't have a lot of details, there is still a lot to break down in this. So I want to bring on forensic psychiatrist Dr. Ziv Cohen. I'm so happy to have Dr. Cohen with us here on Sidebar because he performs and conducts fitness evaluations for teachers. My understanding, Dr. Cohen, is that can include teachers who have had allegations of sexually inappropriate behavior in their past?
That's correct.
And there are circumstances where they're allowed near kids, or am I just making an overgeneralization here?
Well, if there was actual, suspicion of a contact sexual abuse, then they would usually be suspended, very quickly and removed from children, and then there would be disciplinary procedures. But often there are teachers who come my way where there's ambiguous behavior. For example, an IT teacher who's noticed that maybe he was flirting with female students or taking pictures of them. So there's a question about, is there some kind of a mental health issue going on? Why is this teacher engaging in this behavior? So those are the types of cases that I've seen.
Let me break that down for a second. Before we even get into this case, I find that fascinating. Look, schools can not hire somebody for a lot of different reasons. You've seen examples before where somebody has maybe not convicted of a crime, but they've done something that questions their sexual proclivities, or they've engaged in certain kind of behavior. They go to therapy. And they ultimately, a school will hire them after that.
Well, sure. So these are teachers that are, already working, and, I'm in the New York area. So most of these school districts, have unions, and there are rules about, how teachers can be fired or let go. So in this type of situation, if a teacher is engaging in behavior that is suspicious or ambiguous, but there's not a clear indication of a boundary violation, then they might give the teacher a warning and then send them for an evaluation to try to understand, is there some mental health issue? Is there something that we're missing here? And to get advice from a mental health professional about whether this person is safe around children.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the allegations here. We obviously don't have a lot of details. We don't know what the allegations are exactly. We know the charges, right? We can try to put 2 and 2 together about what allegedly happened here. We don't know for sure. But the story of an educator allegedly having sexual relations with a minor student is not something new, and not something new that we cover here on Sidebar. What do you make of it?
Well, it does seem to be a trend that's been worsening in recent years, but to some extent, there's also been a lack of awareness. So we usually think of sexual abusers of children as being men who are abusing usually opposite sex kids, so girls. And then, we've had more awareness in recent decades about pedophilia that involves men on boys. And often we don't think of women as having sexual perversions in the way that men do. And it is true that most sexual perversions are found in men. So if you do surveys of sexual behavior, the vast majority of what we would consider paraphilias, which is the psychiatric term for sexual perversion, are actually found in men, not in women. But what we've seen in recent years is that there's been more disclosure and probably increased rates of women abusing children, as students. And the research looking into this seems to indicate that for female teachers, it's usually more contextual and situational. So with male abusers, we often think of a man as having a fixed sexual interest towards kids. And often we think of men who even seek out work with kids because they know they're attracted to kids. But it appears to be the case that for female perpetrators in an organizational setting like a school, they're not usually coming to the school with an interest in children or a sexual attraction to children. And it's really what happens during the course of their employment. There are situations that arise. There's different contexts that they find themselves in where they begin to cross boundaries. And one thing that impacts that is technology. So in most of these cases, the grooming starts with text messages and explicit photos from cell phones. And so that also may explain these potentially increased rates that we're seeing in recent years. There could be a factor here of social media or just different apps where people can communicate with using, texts and emojis and photos, where that's kind of leading to a breakdown in boundaries, the traditional boundaries that you think of between a teacher and a student.
That's so well said. And to give everybody a little bit of an understanding about this, the Daily Mail, they reported that 25 female teachers have been arrested in 16 states in only the last year. So it kind of gives you a weird, interesting perspective on that. But let's make sure we clarify this. Are you saying that this hasn't always happened? This hasn't always been what's been going on, and maybe it wasn't reported? I mean, we live in a day and age where stories can be amplified and ultimately circulated in a way that they've never been before. You're saying there's actual episodes of sexual misconduct happening between female educators and children. This is a real trend. This is a real rise that we're seeing right now. It's not that it's just being reported more.
Well, so I'm saying a couple of things. So I think that this most likely has gone on since time immemorial, and we didn't know about it. And that as we became, as a society, more aware of sexual abuse, we've been more focused on men as
Right.
abusers, and we haven't really been aware that women do it. But we know that it's gone on since time immemorial. I'll give you just one example. If you read Kirk Douglas's autobiography, which I highly recommend, it's a great book, The Ragman's Son, he was a very handsome kid. And he describes in his autobiography that he had a teacher who had a sexual relationship with him. And he never reported it. And this was something that happened. So I'm sure that this has happened since time immemorial. We don't have enough data to say with certainty that it's happening more now than in the past. But my impression is that it is happening more now than in the past.
Yeah.
And we're hearing about so many more cases, and we're also seeing that the age of the boys is starting to trend younger and younger. So the typical typology of a female abuser is someone in their mid-20s to their mid-30s. So it's not usually a brand new teacher. It's usually an early or mid-career teacher. The teachers are usually experienced, and they don't have a history of abusing anyone, but they start to try to have their emotional needs being met through relationships with students, either because they're lonely or isolated, or things aren't going well in their own relationship, or they develop a depression, and they start to cross boundaries with these boys. But traditionally, we thought of the female abusers as abusing older adolescent boys who were 15 or 16 years old. And like in this case, the boy was 14, and we've seen a trend of younger and younger boys. And again, we've seen that this is often beginning through cell phone use. So I think that if you put that together, it does sound like the numbers are increasing and the severity of this pattern of abuse is worsening as well.
Let's explore that a bit. And I think you make a great point that with the advent of technology, with the advent of social media, phones, those barriers can be broken down. But you got to the heart of what I was trying to understand is why this is happening. So if you have female educators who are, like you said, lonely, or they're in a bad relationship, now they are in a position around these young students, both boys, girls. And what I think is interesting, isn't it an element of control too? So the younger that they are, the more they can control and shape them. Isn't that another way of understanding it as well?
Well, there are definitely power dynamics in abuse, in all types of abuse, and I definitely agree with that. I mean, just the inherent uh, fact that the teacher is seeking out a relationship with a minor indicates that there's something the teacher is getting out of the power differential and feeling in control. And I would agree that the younger that the child is, the more impressionable they are, and the less they're able to really be an equal in the relationship. So I definitely think that's true. Um, Look, I think that these uh, teachers who are deluding themselves, right? So they're either denying to themselves that they're actually engaging in inappropriate and illegal behavior, or they may have a savior complex. Some of these teachers have been known to say, no, I was trying to help him. He was having problems with school, or he wasn't doing well socially, and I thought that I could boost his confidence. Or they may have delusions where they feel like they are, infatuated with this child and fantasize about a future with this child. So, clearly there's a mental health component to this, but usually these teachers are aware that what they're doing is illegal.
Yep.
And I think one of the issues is that we've seen a pattern where in some of these women, they will continue the abuse even after it's discovered. So there is a tendency for them to become very fixated on the victim and to feel like they can continue to have a relationship. So I think it's very important for law enforcement and for schools to crack down very, very strongly. We also don't have enough data on recidivism. It appears that usually these women only have one victim, but we don't really have enough data to say that they aren't going to go and reoffend. And so we have to be very careful before we allow these teachers, back in the classroom. And the reason I'm saying that is that there is a bit of a trend where if a male teacher commits a sexual offense against a student, they're immediately let go and never allowed to teach again. They're never given their teaching license back by the state education board. But with females, there has been a pattern of more toleration, of a period of suspension followed by a review to see whether the person is rehabilitated. And I think that if we look at the trend of how this seems to be worsening, I think we have to be very careful about assuming that just because the perpetrator is female, that she can return to the classroom, especially because we now know that this kind of sexual boundary violation and sexual abuse has a long-term impact on the boys.
Let's talk about that.
Sure.
What is
Sure.
the impact on the victim in this case, on the student, on the minor?
So I see a patient, I do a physical examination, we talk about what the options are, I use my expertise.
Well, absolutely. So, 20 years ago, people would kind of wink or laugh and say, well, it's not the same as abusing a girl. Oh, he was lucky, 16-year-old boy got to have a sexual experience with an older woman. But I think that what we've seen over time is that really it interferes with their normal development. It can cause the boy to become fixated on this authority figure rather than developing normal, healthy relationships with girls his own age. And it also can, lead to uh, hypersexualization at a young age where they have unhealthy ideas about sex because they've had this kind of risky sexual relationship with an older person who was sending them, explicit photos and, taking them to her home or in their car. So it really can sexualize the boys, get them to fixate in an unhealthy way, and really become a long-term trauma for them. I'll give you another example from literature. If you saw the Oscar-winning film *The Reader*, which was about a woman who was a former Nazi prison guard, and it's a fictionalized story, but in the story, and this was played by Kate Winslet, and I believe she won an Oscar for it. But and Ray Fiennes was the actor who played the boy. But essentially, she was a former Nazi prison guard, and she started to have a sexually inappropriate relationship with a child living in Germany after the war. And in that novel, and you can see it in the film too, the boy, as he grows up, and again, he's portrayed very beautifully by Ray Fiennes. begins to talk about the trauma actually and the fixation on this woman from having this relationship when he was actually really immature and not ready for it, and that in a sense it distorted and shaped his whole life. He later gets divorced. He has difficulty in relationships. So I think we really can't minimize the seriousness that this has on individuals.
Yeah, we focus so much on the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators that it's important to recognize what the detrimental effects are to the actual victims in this case. And look, to be very, very clear about this, we don't have a lot of the details of this story. These are allegations at this point. We are speaking, Dr. Cohen and I, very generally about what we're seeing across the board here. So some of this may or may not apply to the story at hand. But Dr. Ziv Cohen, I appreciate you giving your perspective on this. It's a really important subject. And again, with such a disturbing trend that we're seeing, whether it's really on the rise or it's because it's being reported more, it's happening. And we're talking about it. And it's a really, really disturbing thing that we're seeing here. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about it, Dr. Cohen.
Great to be here.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.